Private Sarah Martinez had trained for 18 months to earn her place at Fort Braxton, but nothing could have prepared her for the moment when Brigadier General Hartwell would mock her military salute in front of 300 recruits, calling it the most pathetic display of military bearing he'd ever witnessed. What the arrogant general didn't know was that Sarah's father held 4 stars on his uniform and commanded respect from every officer in the Pentagon, including Hartwell's own superiors. The humiliation that was meant to break her spirit would instead expose a culture of discrimination that reached the highest levels of military command. And when the truth finally emerged, it would silence an entire base and change military protocol. Forever, the pre-dawn darkness at Fort Braxton felt heavier than usual as Sarah laced up her combat boots in the cramped barracks. Around her, 47 other female recruits moved with the mechanical precision that 12 weeks of basic training had drilled into their muscle memory. The air was thick with nervous energy and the scent of military-issued soap, a combination that had become as familiar as breathing during her time at the training facility. Sarah had always been different from her fellow recruits, though none of them knew why. While other young women spoke about their civilian jobs, their college experiences, or their reasons for joining the military, Sarah remained quietly focused on her training. She never mentioned her background, never spoke about her family, and certainly never revealed the truth about who her father was. To everyone around her, she was simply another 18-year-old who had enlisted straight out of high school, determined to prove herself in a world that still questioned whether women belonged in combat roles. The morning routine at Fort Braxton was unforgiving and precise. Reveille at 0500 hours, followed by personal hygiene, bunk inspection, and formation by 0545. Sarah had mastered every aspect of military life with an ease that sometimes surprised her drill instructors, but she attributed it to natural aptitude rather than the military environment she'd grown up in. Her movements were crisp, her uniform always immaculate, and her bearing consistently professional. What she couldn't control, however, was the growing tension she felt whenever Brigadier General Hartwell appeared during training exercises. General Hartwell was a career officer with 32 years of service, a man who had earned his rank through a combination of political maneuvering and old-fashioned military networking. He was known throughout Fort Braxton for his traditional views on military service, particularly his belief that certain roles should remain exclusively male. His inspection visits to the female training companies were legendary for their harshness, his criticism cutting and personal. Sarah had watched him reduce other recruits to tears with his verbal assessments, his disdain for female soldiers barely concealed beneath a veneer of professional duty. The morning that would change everything began like any other. The recruits assembled in perfect formation on the main parade ground, their boots creating thunderous echoes against the concrete as they moved into position. Sarah stood in the 3rd row, her rifle held at the precise angle required by military regulation, her eyes focused straight ahead. The September air was crisp, carrying the scent of autumn leaves and the distant smell of breakfast being prepared. In the mess hall, everything felt routine, predictable, safe. General Hartwell's arrival was announced by the sharp blast of a whistle and the commanding voice of drill Sergeant Rodriguez calling the formation to attention. The general's personal aide, a nervous young lieutenant, followed closely behind as Hartwell began his inspection walk through the assembled recruits. His pace was deliberate, calculated to build tension as he examined each soldier's uniform, bearing, and equipment. Sarah could hear his voice carrying across the formation as he offered critiques and corrections, his tone never quite crossing the line into abuse, but always carrying an undercurrent of disapproval. When General Hartwell reached Sarah's row, she felt her heart rate increase slightly. She'd been through dozens of inspections during her training, but something about this particular morning felt different. Perhaps it was the way the general had been particularly harsh with the recruits ahead of her, or maybe it was the subtle shift in the atmosphere that suggested this inspection carried more weight than usual. Whatever the reason, Sarah found herself focusing extra carefully on maintaining perfect military bearing as the general approached her position. The general stopped directly in front of Sarah, his cold gray eyes scanning her uniform with the intensity of a predator studying its prey. She could smell his aftershave, expensive and sharp, mixing with the starch from his perfectly pressed uniform. His inspection was thorough and deliberate, examining her rifle, her boots, the alignment of her insignia, the way her hair was secured. Beneath her military cap, Sarah maintained her position at attention, her eyes focused on a point somewhere beyond the general's shoulder, exactly as she'd been trained. After what felt like an eternity, General Hartwell stepped back and gestured for Sarah to render a military salute. This was standard procedure during formal inspections, a way for officers to assess a recruit's understanding of military courtesy and precision. Sarah had performed this same salute hundreds of times during her training, each movement practiced and refined until it became second nature. She brought her right hand up in a sharp, crisp motion, her fingers extended and joined, her thumb aligned with her index finger, her palm facing downward at a slight angle. The silence that followed was deafening. General Hartwell stared at Sarah's salute for several long seconds, his expression shifting from professional assessment to something approaching amusement. When he finally spoke, his voice carried clearly across the formation, loud enough for every recruit and instructor to hear his words with perfect clarity. "That," he announced with theatrical disdain, "is without question the most pathetic excuse for a military salute I have witnessed in my entire 32 years of service." The words hit Sarah like a physical blow. She maintained her salute position as required, but she could feel heat rising in her cheeks, a combination of embarrassment and confusion that threatened to overwhelm her carefully maintained composure. Around her, she could sense the other recruits shifting uncomfortably, their own anxiety increasing as they witnessed what was happening to their fellow soldier. General Hartwell wasn't finished. He walked in a slow circle around Sarah, his voice carrying his criticism to every corner of the parade ground. "This recruit clearly has no understanding of military bearing, no appreciation for the traditions she claims to want to serve, and absolutely no business attempting to salute officers who have dedicated their lives to this country's defense." The attack continued for what felt like hours, but was probably only minutes. General Hartwell criticized everything about Sarah's salute, from the angle of her hand to the speed of her movement to the expression on her face. He questioned her commitment to military service, her understanding of military history, and her worthiness to wear the uniform she'd earned through months of rigorous training. Each word was chosen for maximum impact, designed to humiliate and demoralize not just Sarah but every female recruit watching the spectacle unfold. Sarah's training kicked in, the mental discipline she'd developed over months of military instruction, helping her maintain her composure despite the verbal assault. She held her salute position until ordered to drop it, her face expressionless, her body rigid with military bearing. But inside, she was processing everything that had just happened, analyzing the general's words and behavior with a clarity that surprised her. What struck her most was not the cruelty of the general's criticism, but its fundamental inaccuracy. Sarah knew her salute had been textbook perfect because she'd been rendering military salutes since she was old enough to walk. She'd grown up around military ceremonies, formal dinners, and official functions where proper military courtesy wasn't just expected but essential. Her salute hadn't been pathetic or improper. It had been executed with the precision and respect that decades of exposure to military culture had ingrained in her very being. The realization that General Hartwell's criticism was based on bias rather than legitimate assessment sparked something dangerous in Sarah's mind. She began to understand that this wasn't really about her salute or her military bearing. This was about a general who had already decided that women didn't belong in his military. who was using his position and authority to reinforce outdated prejudices that had no place in modern military service. As the inspection continued and General Hartwell moved on to other recruits, Sarah found herself paying closer attention to his interactions with her fellow soldiers. She noticed that his criticism of female recruits was consistently harsher than his assessment of male soldiers, even when the women performed tasks with superior skill and precision. She observed that his questions to female recruits focused more on their motivations for joining the military than on their actual performance, as if he was looking for reasons to question their commitment rather than ways to improve their service. The pattern became increasingly clear as the morning progressed. General Hartwell's inspection wasn't a legitimate assessment of recruit readiness. It was a systematic campaign to undermine the confidence and standing of every female soldier under his review. The realization filled Sarah with a cold anger that she struggled to contain beneath her military bearing. When the inspection finally concluded and the recruits were dismissed to their next training activity, Sarah found herself walking alongside several other female soldiers who had witnessed her humiliation. Their expressions were a mixture of sympathy and fear, understanding that what had happened to Sarah could easily happen to any of them. The solidarity was comforting, but it also highlighted the broader problem they all faced as women trying to succeed in an environment where their presence was still questioned by those in positions of ultimate authority. The rest of the day passed in a blur of training exercises, classroom instruction, and military drills. Sarah performed each task with her usual precision and dedication, but part of her mind remained focused on the morning's events. She found herself analyzing not just General Hartwell's behavior, but the entire culture that allowed such behavior to occur without challenge or consequence. During evening personal time, Sarah sat on her bunk writing in the journal she'd maintained. Throughout her military training, the words flowed easily as she documented not just the events of the day, but her growing understanding of the systemic issues that plagued military culture. She wrote about the double standards she'd observed, the way female soldiers were held to different criteria than their male counterparts, and the subtle but persistent message that women were temporary guests in an institution that would always primarily belong to men. What Sarah didn't write about, what she couldn't yet bring herself to commit to paper, was the growing certainty that she would have to take action. The humiliation she'd suffered wasn't just a personal attack. It was an assault on every woman who had chosen to serve their country in uniform. General Hartwell's behavior represented a cancer in military culture that needed to be exposed and eliminated, regardless of the personal cost to those who chose to fight against it. As she prepared for sleep, Sarah found herself thinking about the phone call she hadn't made, the conversation she'd been avoiding since the day she'd arrived at Fort Braxton. She'd promised herself that she would complete her basic training without relying on her family's influence or connections, that she would succeed or fail based entirely on her own merits and abilities. But General Hartwell's attack had changed the equation, transforming her personal challenge into something much larger and more significant. The barracks around her gradually quieted as exhausted recruits settled into sleep. But Sarah remained awake, staring at the ceiling and contemplating the choice that lay ahead of her. She could accept the humiliation, complete her training quietly, and hope to avoid further confrontations with General Hartwell. Or she could fight back, knowing that doing so would inevitably reveal secrets she'd worked hard to keep hidden, and change not just her own military experience but potentially the experiences of every female soldier who came after her. The decision, when it finally came, felt both inevitable and terrifying. Sarah Martinez was tired of watching good soldiers be diminished by outdated prejudices and systematic discrimination. Tomorrow she would begin the process of ensuring that General Hartwell's behavior had consequences, even if those consequences ended up affecting her own military career in ways she couldn't yet imagine. The cafeteria at Fort Braxton buzzed with the usual morning chatter, But Sarah noticed how conversation seemed to stop when she approached tables occupied by other female recruits. Word of yesterday's humiliation had spread through the barracks like wildfire, and now she found herself the subject of whispered discussions and sympathetic glances that made her stomach churn with a mixture of embarrassment and frustration. She carried her breakfast tray to an empty table near the windows, preferring solitude to the awkward comfort her fellow soldiers were trying to offer. Captain Jennifer Walsh approached Sarah's table with the measured stride of someone who had something important to discuss. Walsh was the company commander for the female recruit training program, a decorated officer with 15 years of service who had earned her position through exceptional performance in both combat and administrative roles. Her reputation among the recruits was that of a fair but demanding leader who genuinely cared about the success of every soldier under her command. "Private Martinez," Captain Walsh said, settling into the chair across from Sarah without waiting for an invitation. "I think we need to have a conversation about yesterday's inspection." Sarah looked up from her barely touched scrambled eggs, meeting the captain's steady gaze. Walsh's expression was professional but concerned, the look of an officer who had seen too many promising soldiers derailed by circumstances beyond their control. Sarah had been expecting this conversation since the moment General Hartwell had finished his verbal assault, knowing that incidents of this magnitude rarely went unnoticed by the chain of command. "Ma'am, I followed proper protocol during the inspection," Sarah replied carefully. "My salute was executed according to military regulations as I was taught during training." Captain Walsh nodded slowly. "I reviewed the inspection footage from multiple angles. Your salute was textbook perfect, Private Martinez, which makes General Hartwell's criticism all the more concerning." The admission hung in the air between them, an acknowledgement that what had happened wasn't about military standards or training deficiencies. Sarah felt a flicker of validation, but it was quickly overshadowed by the implications of what the captain was suggesting. If her salute had been correct, then General Hartwell's public humiliation had been based on something other than legitimate military assessment. "Ma'am, are you saying the General's evaluation was inaccurate?" Sarah asked, choosing her words with extreme care. Military protocol required respect for superior officers, even when their behavior was questionable, and any criticism of a general officer could have serious consequences for a private's career. Captain Walsh leaned forward, slightly lowering her voice to ensure their conversation remained private. "I'm saying that General Hartwell has a history of holding female recruits to different standards than their male counterparts. Yesterday's incident wasn't an isolated occurrence, Private Martinez. It was part of a pattern that's been developing over the past several months." The revelation hit Sarah like a physical blow. She had suspected that her treatment was part of a larger problem, but hearing it confirmed by a senior officer made the situation feel infinitely more serious and complex. If Captain Walsh was right, then General Hartwell wasn't just an officer with old-fashioned views. He was actively working to undermine female soldiers through systematic harassment and discrimination. "How many other recruits have been affected?" Sarah asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "In the past 6 months, 17 female recruits have been subjected to what I would consider excessive criticism during General Hartwell's inspections. 3 of them have requested transfers to other training facilities, claiming they couldn't continue their military service under current conditions. 2 others have filed formal complaints through the Inspector General's office, but those complaints have been dismissed due to lack of substantiating evidence." The numbers were staggering, representing dozens of military careers potentially derailed by one officer's prejudices. Sarah thought about the women who had given up their dreams of military service rather than continue fighting against systematic discrimination, and she felt anger building in her chest like a slow-burning fire. What happened to their complaints? Sarah pressed. How were they dismissed without evidence when there were witnesses to every inspection? Captain Walsh's expression darkened. That's where things get complicated, Private Martinez. General Hartwell's inspections are always conducted in front of large formations, with multiple officers and non-commissioned officers present. But when investigators interview potential witnesses, they consistently report that they didn't observe anything inappropriate or outside normal military protocol. Sarah stared at the captain in disbelief. They're lying? They're protecting their careers, Walsh corrected. Challenging a general officer requires an extraordinary level of courage and an ironclad case. Most soldiers, even officers, aren't willing to risk their own advancement to support complaints against someone with that level of authority and influence. The explanation made perfect sense from a practical standpoint, but it also highlighted the fundamental injustice of the situation. Female recruits were being systematically harassed by a senior officer, but the very structure of military hierarchy made it nearly impossible for them to seek effective recourse. The system that was supposed to protect all soldiers was instead protecting the abuser while leaving his victims without meaningful support. "What about the video footage?" Sarah asked. "You said you reviewed multiple angles of yesterday's inspection." "Captain." Walsh shook her head grimly. "The footage shows exactly what happened, but it doesn't capture the full context of General Hartwell's criticism. His words were harsh, but they could be interpreted as tough but legitimate military instruction rather than harassment. Without additional evidence or testimony from other officers, the footage alone wouldn't be sufficient to support formal charges." Sarah pushed her breakfast tray away, her appetite completely gone. The futility of the situation was becoming clear, and she was beginning to understand why so many other female recruits had chosen to give up rather than continue fighting against an opponent who seemed to hold all the advantages. "So what are my options?" she asked finally. "You can file a formal complaint, knowing that it will likely be dismissed and that doing so will mark you as a troublemaker for the remainder of your military career. You can request a transfer to another training facility, which might be approved but would require starting your basic training over from the beginning. Or you can complete your training here and hope that General Hartwell's attention moves on to other targets." None of the options were acceptable to Sarah. Filing a complaint that would be dismissed seemed pointless. Starting over at a new facility would delay her military career by months, and accepting continued harassment violated every principle she'd been raised to uphold. She found herself thinking about the lessons her father had taught her about standing up to bullies, about the importance of fighting for what was right even when the odds seemed impossible. "There's something else you should know," Captain Walsh continued, her voice taking on an even more serious tone. "General Hartwell has been asking questions about your background, your family, your reasons for enlisting. It's unusual for a general officer to take such personal interest in an individual recruit, especially after a single inspection incident." Sarah's blood ran cold. Her entire strategy for completing basic training had been built around maintaining anonymity, avoiding any special attention that might reveal her family connections. If General Hartwell was already investigating her background, it was only a matter of time before he discovered information that would completely change the dynamic of their conflict. "What kind of questions?" Sarah asked, though she was afraid. She already knew the answer. "He's requested access to your personnel file, your educational records, your family information. He's also been asking other officers if they've noticed anything unusual about your military bearing or training background. It's almost as if he suspects you're not exactly what you appear to be." The captain's words confirmed Sarah's worst fears. Her military bearing, the precision of her movements, the ease with which she'd adapted to military protocol, all of these things that she'd thought were helping her succeed were actually drawing unwanted attention from exactly the wrong person. General Hartwell was smart enough to recognize that her military knowledge went beyond what basic training could provide, and he was apparently determined to discover why. "Ma'am, what happens if he finds out about my family?" Sarah asked, knowing that Captain Walsh had probably already conducted her own investigation into her background. Captain Walsh was quiet for a long moment, studying Sarah's face with an expression that suggested she knew more than she was saying. That depends on what exactly there is to find out, Private Martinez. Is there something in your background that you think would interest General Hartwell? Sarah realized she was at a crossroads. She could continue maintaining her cover, hoping that General Hartwell's investigation wouldn't uncover the truth about her father's identity. Or she could trust Captain Walsh with information that could completely change her military experience, but might also provide the leverage needed to address the systematic problems she'd discovered. My father is a career military officer, Sarah said finally, choosing her words carefully. He holds a senior position in the Pentagon. Captain Walsh's eyebrows rose slightly, but her expression remained professional. How senior? Senior enough that General Hartwell would probably recognize his name. The admission hung between them like a loaded weapon. Sarah had just revealed the secret she'd been guarding since the day she arrived at Fort Braxton, the information that could either solve her problems or create entirely new ones. She watched Captain Walsh process this revelation, seeing the officer's mind working through the implications and possibilities. Private Martinez, does your father know about yesterday's incident? No, ma'am. I haven't spoken to my family since I began basic training. I wanted to complete my military service based on my own merits, without any special treatment or consideration based on my family connections. Captain Walsh leaned back in her chair, a slight smile playing at the corners of her mouth. That's admirable, Private Martinez, but it might not be practical given your current situation. General Hartwell isn't going to stop his investigation, and when he discovers your father's identity, the dynamic of this entire situation is going to change dramatically. How so? Because if your father is who I think he might be, General Hartwell is going to realize that he's made a very serious mistake. The kind of mistake that can end careers and destroy reputations. Which means he's going to become very dangerous very quickly. Sarah felt a chill run down her spine. She had hoped that revealing her family background might provide some protection or leverage, but Captain Walsh's reaction suggested that it might actually escalate the conflict to an entirely new level. What do you think I should do? Captain. Walsh stood up, her expression becoming carefully neutral as other officers began entering the cafeteria for their morning meal. I think you should be very careful, Private Martinez. And I think you should consider whether completing your basic training quietly is worth the risk of what might happen when General Hartwell discovers the truth about your family. As the captain walked away, Sarah found herself alone with her thoughts and a growing sense of dread. She had wanted to serve her country based on her own merits, to prove that she could succeed without relying on her family's influence or connections. But General Hartwell's harassment had forced her into a position where those connections might become impossible to hide. The morning training schedule proceeded normally, but Sarah found it difficult to concentrate on the various exercises and instruction sessions. She kept thinking about Captain Walsh's warning, about General Hartwell's investigation, and about the inevitable moment when her carefully maintained cover would be blown. Part of her wanted to contact her father immediately, to seek his advice and protection before the situation escalated further, but another part of her refused to give up on her original plan. She had come to Fort Braxton to prove herself as a soldier, not as the daughter of a senior officer. Taking the easy way out now would validate every prejudice that General Hartwell held about women in the military, suggesting that female soldiers needed special protection and couldn't handle the same challenges faced by their male counterparts. During the afternoon combat training exercise, Sarah found herself paired with Private Jessica Chun, a quiet recruit from California who had been one of the witnesses to yesterday's humiliation. As they practiced hand-to-hand combat techniques, Chun spoke in low tones that wouldn't carry to the instructors monitoring their training. Martinez, there's something you should know. Chen said as they grappled for position during a defensive maneuver drill. Some of the other recruits have been talking about what happened yesterday. They're planning to submit a group statement, supporting your account of the inspection incident. Sarah nearly lost her grip on Chen's uniform in surprise. That's not necessary. I can handle this situation myself. Maybe, but you shouldn't have to. What General Hartwell did was wrong, and everyone who saw it knows it was wrong. We're tired of watching him attack female recruits while everyone else stays silent. The offer of support was touching, but Sarah knew it could also be dangerous for the women involved. Group complaints could be dismissed as conspiracy or coordination, and participating in such actions could mark all of them for retaliation by General Hartwell and his supporters. I appreciate the solidarity, Sarah replied, but I don't want anyone else's career to be damaged because of my problems with General Hartwell. Chen executed a particularly aggressive takedown move, her frustration evident in the force of her actions. Don't you get it, Martinez? This isn't just your problem. General Hartwell has been targeting female recruits for months, and it's getting worse. If we don't stand up to him now, he's going to keep doing this until he drives every woman out of the military. The conversation was interrupted by a drill instructor calling for the next exercise rotation, but Chen's words echoed in Sarah's mind for the rest of the afternoon. She was beginning to realize that her individual conflict with General Hartwell was part of a much larger battle for the future of women in military service. As evening approached and the recruits prepared for their final meal of the day, Sarah made a decision that would change everything. She would continue to keep her family background secret for now, but she would also stop trying to handle the situation entirely on her own. If General Hartwell wanted a fight, she would give him one, but she would fight smart, and she would fight with allies. The question now was whether she could expose General Hartwell's systematic discrimination before he discovered her true identity and used that information to discredit everything she was trying to accomplish. Time was running out, and Sarah knew that the next few days would determine not just her own military future, but the future of every woman who came after her. Sarah's decision to investigate General Hartwell's pattern of behavior began with a careful study of the base's daily routine and the general's schedule. She spent her free time observing his movements, noting when he conducted inspections, which units he visited most frequently, and how he interacted with different groups of soldiers. What she discovered was both systematic and disturbing. General Hartwell's harassment wasn't random or impulsive, but rather a carefully orchestrated campaign designed to undermine female soldiers' confidence and drive them out of military service. Base Library became Sarah's primary research location during evening personal time. Fort Braxton maintained extensive records of training incidents, personnel transfers, and disciplinary actions, and while most sensitive information was classified, there were public records that painted a troubling picture of recent trends in female recruit retention. Sarah discovered that the rate of female soldiers requesting transfers or early discharge had increased by 47% since General Hartwell's assignment to Fort Braxton 8 months earlier. Private Chen had been true to her word about organizing support among the female recruits. During mess hall conversations and informal gatherings, Sarah learned that General Hartwell's targeting of women went far beyond public humiliation during inspections. Female soldiers reported being assigned to more dangerous training exercises, receiving harsher punishments for minor infractions, and being excluded from leadership development opportunities that were routinely offered to male recruits with similar or inferior performance records. The pattern was sophisticated enough to avoid triggering formal discrimination complaints, while still creating an environment that was hostile to female service members. Each individual incident could be explained away as normal military discipline or training requirements, but the cumulative effect was to make military service significantly more difficult and less rewarding for women than for their male counterparts. Sarah's Investigation took on new urgency when she learned about Private Rebecca Torres, a recruit who had been forced to repeat her basic training after failing physical fitness tests that other soldiers swore she had actually passed. Torres had been one of General Hartwell's most frequent targets, subjected to daily criticism that went far beyond normal military instruction. According to witnesses, her failures had occurred only when General Hartwell himself was conducting the evaluations, while she consistently met or exceeded standards when tested by other officers. The Torres case represented a troubling escalation in General Hartwell's campaign against female soldiers. Rather than simply harassing women until they voluntarily left military service, he was now actively manipulating their training records to create grounds for involuntary discharge. If this pattern continued unchecked, it would effectively bar women from completing basic training at Fort Braxton, regardless of their actual capabilities or performance. During a particularly intense combat training exercise, Sarah found herself working alongside Sergeant Maria Rodriguez, one of the few female non-commissioned officers stationed at Fort Braxton. Rodriguez had been at the base for 3 years, arriving shortly before General Hartwell's assignment, and she had witnessed the dramatic change in culture that had occurred under his leadership. "It wasn't always like this," Rodriguez explained, as they cleaned their weapons after the training session. "When I first arrived here, Fort Braxton had one of the best reputations for female soldier development in the entire Army. We were producing exceptional officers and enlisted personnel who went on to distinguished careers throughout the military." Sarah looked up from her rifle maintenance, interested in learning more about the base's history. What changed? General Hartwell brought with him a very specific philosophy about military service and gender roles. He believes that women can serve in support capacities, but that combat positions and leadership roles should remain exclusively male. He's never stated this position officially, but his actions make his beliefs very clear. Rodriguez's assessment confirmed what Sarah had already suspected about General Hartwell's motivations. This wasn't simply a case of an officer with old-fashioned views struggling to adapt to modern military requirements. It was a deliberate campaign to reverse decades of progress in gender integration within the armed forces. "Has anyone tried to challenge his policies?" Sarah asked. "Several officers have raised concerns through proper channels, but General Hartwell is very careful to operate within the bounds of official military regulations. His methods are subtle enough to avoid triggering formal investigations, but effective enough to achieve his desired results." The conversation was interrupted by the approach of Lieutenant Colonel Harrison, General Hartwell's second-in-command and a known supporter of his policies regarding female soldiers. Harrison was a thin, nervous man with 25 years of service who had never seen combat, but had built his career through administrative excellence and political maneuvering. "Sergeant Rodriguez," Harrison said with forced cordiality, "I need to speak with Private Martinez privately." Sarah felt her stomach clench with anxiety, but she maintained her military bearing as Rodriguez gathered her equipment and moved away from their cleaning station. Harrison waited until they were alone before settling into the chair Rodriguez had vacated, his expression serious and slightly predatory. "Private Martinez, I understand you've been asking a lot of questions lately about base policies and procedures. I wanted to make sure you understand that curiosity can sometimes be misinterpreted as insubordination, especially when it comes to questioning the decisions of senior officers." The warning was delivered with a pleasant tone that made it all the more menacing. Sarah realized that her investigation hadn't been as subtle as she'd hoped, and that General Hartwell's supporters were already aware of her activities. "Sir, I've simply been trying to understand military culture and traditions as part of my development as a soldier," Sarah replied carefully. Harrison smiled, but the expression didn't reach his eyes. "Of course, that's commendable. But I want to make sure you understand that some aspects of military culture are best learned through direct experience rather than investigation. Some questions are better left unasked, particularly by junior personnel who might not fully understand the complexities involved. I understand, sir. Good. I also wanted to let you know that General Hartwell has been very impressed with your military bearing and attention to detail. He's expressed particular interest in your background and training preparation. It's unusual for a general officer to take such personal interest in an individual recruit, but he feels you might have exceptional potential for military service. Sarah's blood ran cold at this information. General Hartwell's interest was exactly what she'd been trying to avoid, and the fact that he was now actively investigating her background meant that her cover was in serious jeopardy. I'm honored by General Hartwell's attention, sir, but I hope to complete my basic training without requiring any special consideration. Harrison leaned forward slightly, his voice dropping to a more intimate tone. Private Martinez, let me give you some advice that could be very valuable for your military career. General Hartwell rewards loyalty and punishes disloyalty. Soldiers who support his vision for military excellence find themselves with opportunities for advancement and prestigious assignments. Soldiers who question or oppose his methods find their careers taking very different directions. The threat was barely concealed beneath Harrison's professional demeanor. Sarah understood that she was being offered a choice: abandon her investigation and support General Hartwell's discriminatory policies, or face the consequences of continued resistance. I appreciate your guidance, sir. I'll certainly keep your advice in mind as I continue my training. Harrison stood up, apparently satisfied that his message had been delivered effectively. Excellent. I'm sure you'll make the right choices. Private Martinez, General Hartwell has very high expectations for your future service. After Harrison left, Sarah sat alone in the equipment cleaning area, her mind racing with the implications of what had just occurred. The conversation had confirmed that her investigation was known to General Hartwell's inner circle, that they viewed her activities as a threat, and that they were prepared to use both rewards and punishments to secure her cooperation. More troubling was Harrison's reference to General Hartwell's high expectations for her future service. Sarah suspected this meant that the general had discovered something about her background that made her particularly valuable as either an ally or a target. Either way, her anonymity was compromised, and she would need to be much more careful about how she proceeded. That evening, Sarah made a decision that went against every instinct she'd developed during her military training. Instead of attending the usual evening briefing and study session, she slipped away from the barracks and made her way to a secluded area near the base communications center. Using a secure phone that she'd located during her earlier reconnaissance, she placed a call that she'd been avoiding since the day she arrived at Fort Braxton. Colonel Martinez speaking, came the familiar voice after 3 rings. Dad, it's Sarah. I need to talk to you about something important. The pause that followed was brief but loaded with concern. Sarah, is everything all right? You're not supposed to contact family during basic training, except in emergencies. I think this qualifies as an emergency, Dad. I'm having problems with a senior officer here who's been targeting female recruits for harassment and discrimination. Another pause, longer this time. How senior? Brigadier General Thomas Hartwell. Sarah heard her father's sharp intake of breath, followed by what sounded like papers rustling as he presumably pulled up information about General Hartwell on his computer. Sarah, I need you to be very careful about how you handle this situation. General Hartwell has powerful supporters in the Pentagon, and challenging him could have serious consequences for your military career. Dad, he's systematically driving women out of military service. He humiliated me in front of 300 recruits yesterday, and I've discovered that I'm just the latest in a long pattern of harassment and discrimination. I understand your frustration, sweetheart, but you need to think about the bigger picture here. Sometimes the best way to create change is to work within the system rather than confronting it directly. Sarah felt a surge of disappointment at her father's response. She had hoped for immediate support and assistance, but instead, she was getting the same cautious political advice that had allowed General Hartwell's behavior to continue unchecked. So I should just accept the harassment and hope things get better on their own. I'm saying you should be smart about how you proceed. Document everything, build a solid case, and work through proper channels. If you have evidence of systematic discrimination, there are people who will listen and take action. What if proper channels have already failed? What if General Hartwell's supporters are protecting him from investigation and accountability? Her father was quiet for a long moment, and Sarah could practically hear him weighing political considerations against parental concern. Sarah, there's something you need to know about General Hartwell. He's being considered for promotion to Major General, and he has the support of some very influential people in the Department of Defense. Challenging him right now, especially as a recruit in basic training, could be seen as an attack on the promotion process itself. The revelation explained a lot about General Hartwell's behavior and the protection he seemed to enjoy from higher authorities. If he was up for promotion, his supporters would be highly motivated to suppress any information that might derail his advancement. Dad, does that mean women are supposed to just accept discrimination because challenging it might inconvenience someone's career plans? It means you need to be very careful about timing and strategy. If you're going to take on someone with General Hartwell's level of protection, you need overwhelming evidence and unassailable credibility. Sarah felt a growing sense of isolation as she realized that even her father, despite his senior position and obvious concern for her welfare, was not prepared to offer the kind of support she needed. I have to go, Dad. Thanks for the advice. Sarah. Wait. I want to help you, but I need you to understand the realities of military politics. If you're determined to proceed with this, make sure you have everything documented and verified. And be prepared for the possibility that things might get worse before they get better. After ending the call, Sarah sat in the darkness near the communications center, feeling more alone than she had since arriving at Fort Braxton. Her father's warnings about General Hartwell's political protection had confirmed her worst fears about the obstacles she faced, but they had also strengthened her resolve to continue fighting. If General Hartwell was being considered for promotion to Major General, then his current assignment at Fort Braxton was essentially a final evaluation of his leadership capabilities. Any evidence of systematic discrimination or harassment would be devastating to his advancement prospects, which explained why he was being so careful to operate within the bounds of official regulations. But it also meant that Sarah's window of opportunity was closing rapidly. Once General Hartwell received his promotion and moved on to a new assignment, the culture he'd created at Fort Braxton would become entrenched, and future female soldiers would have to endure the same systematic harassment that had driven so many others away from military service. As she made her way back to the barracks, Sarah realized that her investigation would have to become much more aggressive and targeted. She would need concrete evidence of General Hartwell's discriminatory policies, witness testimony from soldiers who had been affected by his harassment, and documentation that could withstand the scrutiny of a formal military investigation. Task seemed almost impossible, but Sarah had learned something important from her conversation with her father. The very fact that General Hartwell was up for promotion meant that powerful people were watching his performance closely. If she could present them with undeniable evidence of his misconduct, they might be forced to act regardless of their personal loyalties or political considerations. Time was running out, but Sarah Martinez had never backed down from a challenge in her life. Tomorrow, she would begin building the case that would either expose General Hartwell's corruption or destroy her own military career in the attempt. Sarah's breakthrough came from an unexpected source during the third week of October. Private Ashley Williams, A recruit from Georgia who had been discharged the previous month for failure to meet military standards contacted Sarah through an encrypted messaging app that soldiers sometimes use to communicate with family members. Williams had heard about Sarah's confrontation with General Hartwell through the informal network of former recruits who stayed in touch despite their forced departures from Fort Braxton. The message was brief but explosive. "I have recordings of my training sessions. General Hartwell doesn't know they exist. We need to talk." Sarah arranged to meet Williams at a coffee shop 15 miles from the base during her next authorized weekend leave. The drive through the rural North Carolina countryside gave her time to think about the risks she was taking and the potential consequences of what she was discovering. Meeting with a discharged recruit could be seen as conspiracy or insubordination, but the possibility of obtaining concrete evidence of General Hartwell's misconduct was too valuable to ignore. Williams looked tired and defeated when Sarah found her sitting in a corner booth of the small diner. She had been one of the most promising recruits in her training company, with exceptional physical fitness scores and natural leadership abilities that had impressed instructors throughout her time at Fort Braxton. Her forced discharge had been a shock to everyone who knew her, including several drill sergeants who had privately questioned the validity of the charges against her. "I've been thinking about this for weeks," Williams said after Sarah joined her at the table. "Part of me just wants to forget about Fort Braxton and move on with my life. But I keep thinking about the women who are still there, still dealing with General Hartwell's harassment." Sarah ordered coffee and settled in for what she hoped would be an enlightening conversation. "Tell me about the recordings." Williams pulled out a small digital device that looked like a standard fitness tracker, but was actually a sophisticated recording system. "My father gave this to me before I left for basic training. He was worried about hazing and wanted me to have some protection if things got out of hand. I never thought I'd actually need to use it." The device contained over 40 hours of recorded interactions between Williams and various Fort Braxton personnel, including several extended sessions where General Hartwell had subjected her to what could only be described as psychological torture disguised as military training. Sarah listened to excerpts through earbuds, her anger growing with each example of the general's systematic cruelty. In one recording, General Hartwell could be heard berating Williams for nearly 20 minutes about her fundamental unsuitability for military service, questioning her intelligence, her physical capabilities, and her moral character in language that went far beyond any legitimate training purpose. In another, he deliberately assigned her to dangerous training exercises that had injured several previous recruits, claiming that real soldiers should be able to handle any challenge. Most damaging was a recording of General Hartwell speaking privately with Lieutenant Colonel Harrison about his strategy for reducing female enrollment at Fort Braxton. The conversation had been captured when Williams was assigned to cleaning duty outside the general's office, and her recording device had picked up their discussion through the partially open door. The key is to make their experience unpleasant enough that they choose to leave voluntarily. General Hartwell's voice was clearly audible on the recording. "We can't officially discriminate, but we can certainly make them understand that they don't belong in combat roles." Harrison's response was equally incriminating. "What about the ones who refuse to quit? Williams, for example, seems determined to complete her training despite everything we've thrown at her. Then we find other ways to remove them," General Hartwell replied. "Training failures, disciplinary issues, psychological evaluations that question their fitness for service. There are always options for commanders who understand their responsibilities." Sarah felt her hands shaking as she listened to the recording. This was exactly the kind of evidence she needed to prove systematic discrimination, but it was also terrifying in its implications. General Hartwell and his supporters weren't just harassing female recruits. They were actively conspiring to manipulate training results and fabricate grounds for discharge. "How did they finally get rid of you?" Sarah asked. Williams's expression darkened. "They staged a training accident. I was assigned to a rope climbing exercise that had been sabotaged beforehand. The rope snapped when I was 30 feet up, and I fell hard enough to injure my back and shoulder. Then they claimed I had failed to follow safety protocols and used the injury as grounds for medical discharge. Do you have evidence of the sabotage? I have photographs of the rope before and after the accident. The break was clearly caused by deliberate cutting rather than normal wear. I also have witness statements from other recruits who saw the setup beforehand. Sarah realized she was looking at a conspiracy that went far beyond harassment and discrimination. General Hartwell and his supporters were apparently willing to cause physical injury to female recruits in order to manufacture grounds for their removal from military service. Why haven't you taken this to the authorities? Williams laughed bitterly. I tried. I filed complaints with the Inspector General, the Equal Opportunity Office, and the base commander. Every single complaint was dismissed due to insufficient evidence or conflicting witness statements. It turns out that a discharged recruit's word doesn't carry much weight against a general officer's reputation. The pattern was becoming clear to Sarah. General Hartwell's protection extended throughout the base hierarchy, with officers at every level either supporting his policies or too intimidated to oppose them. Challenging the system would require evidence so overwhelming that it couldn't be dismissed or suppressed through normal channels. What do you want me to do with this information? Sarah asked. I want you to find the other women who've been forced out and collect their stories. I want you to document every case of harassment and discrimination. And I want you to find someone with enough authority and integrity to actually do something about it. Sarah spent the rest of the afternoon listening to Williams's recordings and reviewing the documentation she had collected during her time at Fort Braxton. The evidence was damning, but Sarah also understood why previous complaints had been unsuccessful. Each individual incident could be explained away or minimized, and discharged recruits had limited credibility when challenging the decisions of senior officers. What was needed was a broader pattern of evidence that demonstrated systematic discrimination across multiple cases and time periods. Sarah would need to contact other former recruits, document additional incidents, and find current personnel who were willing to testify about what they had witnessed. The task seemed overwhelming, but Sarah had an advantage that previous complainants had lacked. She was still an active recruit with access to base personnel and records. She could investigate from within the system while building connections with former recruits who had been forced out. Over the following weeks, Sarah developed a careful strategy for expanding her investigation without alerting General Hartwell supporters to her activities. She used her cleaning duties and work assignments to access different areas of the base, gathering information about training policies, personnel decisions, and disciplinary actions involving female recruits. She also began reaching out to former recruits through the network that Williams had established. Each conversation revealed new examples of harassment, discrimination, and systematic efforts to drive women away from military service. The stories were remarkably consistent, suggesting that General Hartwell had developed a standard playbook for targeting female soldiers. Private Elena Rodriguez had been forced out after receiving consistently negative evaluations from instructors who had previously praised her performance. Private Jennifer Kim had been subjected to additional physical training, requirements that were never applied to male recruits with similar fitness scores. Private Monica Jefferson had been assigned to dangerous equipment maintenance duties without proper safety training, resulting in an injury that was then used to justify her medical discharge. Each case followed the same pattern: initial harassment, designed to encourage voluntary departure, followed by increasingly aggressive tactics when the recruit refused to quit. General Hartwell's methods were sophisticated enough to avoid obvious legal violations, while still achieving his desired results. Sarah's investigation took on new urgency when she learned that General Hartwell's promotion to Major General was expected to be announced within the next month. Once he received his new assignment and left Fort Braxton, the evidence of his misconduct would become much more difficult to pursue, and his replacement might continue the discriminatory policies he had established. The breakthrough Sarah needed came from an unexpected source: Sergeant Rodriguez, the female non-commissioned officer who had spoken with her weeks earlier about the changes at Fort Braxton. Rodriguez had been conducting her own quiet investigation into General Hartwell's policies, motivated by her concern for the female soldiers under her supervision. "I've been documenting everything," Rodriguez told Sarah during a private conversation. "In the equipment storage room. Training modifications, assignment changes, disciplinary actions, medical evaluations. I've been building a file for months, waiting for the right opportunity to bring it forward." Rodriguez's documentation was extensive and professionally compiled, with detailed records of every discriminatory action taken against female recruits during General Hartwell's tenure at Fort Braxton. She had also identified several male officers and non-commissioned officers who were disturbed by what they had witnessed but had been too intimidated to speak out publicly. "Why haven't you taken this to higher authorities?" Sarah asked. "Because I need someone with credibility and protection to present the evidence. A sergeant making accusations against a general officer is career suicide unless the case is absolutely airtight and supported by unassailable witnesses." Sarah understood what Rodriguez was suggesting. The investigation needed someone with sufficient status or protection to challenge General Hartwell without fear of immediate retaliation. Sarah's family background might provide that protection, but revealing her connections would also compromise her ability to gather additional evidence from within the recruit population. "There's something else," Rodriguez continued. "I've learned that General Hartwell's promotion is contingent on a final evaluation of his leadership performance at Fort Braxton. The evaluation team is scheduled to visit next week, and they'll be interviewing personnel about base operations and training effectiveness." Sarah felt her pulse quicken. The evaluation visit represented the perfect opportunity to present evidence of General Hartwell's misconduct to officials who had the authority to act on it. But it also meant that time was running out for her investigation. Who's conducting the evaluation? A team from the Pentagon, led by Major General Patricia Coleman. She's known for her commitment to fair treatment and equal opportunity in military service. If anyone would be willing to listen to evidence of discrimination, it would be her. Sarah spent the next several days frantically organizing the evidence she and her allies had collected. Williams's recordings, Rodriguez's documentation, and the testimony of former recruits created a compelling case for systematic discrimination. But Sarah knew that presenting it effectively would require careful planning and strategic timing. Challenge was finding a way to get the evidence to Major General Coleman without alerting General Hartwell's supporters to her intentions. Sarah would need to approach the evaluation team directly, bypassing the normal chain of command that had protected General Hartwell from previous complaints. As the evaluation team's arrival approached, Sarah found herself facing the most important decision of her military career. She could present the evidence and risk destroying her own future prospects, or she could remain silent and watch General Hartwell receive a promotion that would validate his discriminatory policies and extend them to whatever command he received. Next up, the choice, when it came, felt inevitable. Sarah had not joined the military to advance her own career at the expense of justice and equality. She had enlisted to serve her country and protect the values that made military service meaningful. If that meant sacrificing her own ambitions to expose corruption and discrimination, then that was a price she was willing to pay. On the morning that Major General Coleman's evaluation team arrived at Fort Braxton, Sarah Martinez made final preparations to present evidence that would either transform military culture or end her own career in disgrace. Either way, she was determined to ensure that General Hartwell's systematic harassment of female soldiers would finally face the scrutiny and accountability it deserved. The time for investigation and preparation was over. Now came the moment of truth that would determine whether courage and evidence could triumph over power and political protection. Major General Patricia Coleman arrived at Fort Braxton with an entourage that immediately signaled the importance of the evaluation visit. Her team included 3 full colonels, 2 lieutenant colonels, and a civilian analyst from the Department of Defense's Equal Opportunity Office. Coleman herself was an imposing figure with 28 years of military service, including combat deployments in Iraq and Afghanistan, and a reputation for demanding excellence and integrity from every officer under her command. Sarah watched the evaluation team's arrival from the window of the equipment maintenance building, where she was completing her assigned duties. General Hartwell had positioned himself prominently at the main gate to greet the visiting officials, his dress uniform immaculate and his demeanor projecting the confident authority of a successful commander. Lieutenant Colonel Harrison and the other senior staff members flanked him in perfect formation, creating an impressive display of military precision and leadership. The choreographed welcome ceremony was exactly what Sarah had expected from General Hartwell. Every detail had been planned to present Fort Braxton as a model military installation under his exemplary leadership. The base had been cleaned and polished to perfection. Problematic personnel had been reassigned to duties that would keep them away from the evaluation team. And the training schedule had been modified to showcase only the most successful programs and exercises. What General Hartwell didn't know was that Sarah had spent the previous week establishing contact with Major General Coleman's advance team. Through carefully crafted communications that highlighted concerns about training effectiveness and personnel policies at Fort Braxton, Sarah had been deliberately vague about the specific nature of her concerns, but she had provided enough information to ensure that Coleman's team would be looking for signs of the problems. She was prepared to document the first day of the evaluation proceeded according to General Hartwell's carefully planned schedule. The visiting team toured training facilities, observed combat exercises, and met with selected personnel who had been coached to provide positive assessments of base operations and leadership. Sarah watched these orchestrated presentations with growing frustration, knowing that the evaluation team was seeing only the carefully sanitized version of life at Fort Braxton. Her opportunity came during the second day of the visit, when Major General Coleman announced that she wanted to conduct private interviews with randomly selected personnel from all levels of the base hierarchy. This deviation from the planned schedule clearly frustrated General Hartwell, but he had no choice but to comply with the request from a senior officer. Conducting an official evaluation. Sarah had prepared extensively for this moment, organizing her evidence into a coherent presentation that would be both compelling and credible. She had coordinated with Sergeant Rodriguez to ensure that supporting documentation would be available, and she had confirmed that Ashley Williams and other former recruits were prepared to provide testimony if needed. When Sarah received notification that she had been selected for a private interview with Major General Coleman, she felt her heart racing with a combination of anticipation and terror. This was the moment she had been working toward for weeks, but it was also the point of no return. Once she presented her evidence to Coleman, there would be no way to withdraw or minimize her accusations against General Hartwell. The interview took place in a secure conference room that had been designated for the evaluation team's exclusive use. Major General Coleman sat across from Sarah at a simple metal table, her expression professional but curious. 2 of her staff officers were also present, one taking notes while the other operated a digital recording device. Private Martinez. Coleman began. I understand you requested this interview to discuss concerns about training policies and procedures at Fort Braxton. Please tell me what's on your mind. Sarah took a deep breath, knowing that her next words would change everything. Ma'am, I have evidence of systematic discrimination against female recruits by Brigadier General Hartwell and his senior staff. This discrimination includes harassment, deliberate training failures, and orchestrated injuries designed to force women out of military service. The room fell silent. Major General Coleman's expression didn't change, but Sarah noticed that both staff officers had stopped what they were doing and were now focused entirely on her words. "Those are very serious allegations, Private Martinez. What evidence do you have to support these claims?" Sarah reached into her uniform pocket and withdrew a secure data storage device that contained all of the documentation she and her allies had collected. "Ma'am, I have audio recordings of General Hartwell discussing his strategy for reducing female enrollment at Fort Braxton. I have documentation of training modifications that specifically target female recruits. I have witness statements from former recruits who were forced out through fraudulent means. And I have testimony from current personnel who have observed these discriminatory practices." Coleman accepted the storage device and handed it to one of her staff officers. "How did you obtain these recordings and documents?" "The recordings were made by Private Ashley Williams, who was discharged last month after a suspicious training accident. She provided them to me along with documentation of her case. Additional evidence was compiled by Sergeant Maria Rodriguez, who has been documenting discriminatory practices for several months. Why didn't these individuals present this evidence through normal channels?" Sarah had anticipated this question and had prepared a careful response. "Ma'am, multiple complaints have been filed through official channels and have been dismissed due to alleged lack of evidence or conflicting witness statements. The pattern suggests that General Hartwell supporters throughout the base hierarchy have been suppressing legitimate complaints." Coleman leaned forward slightly, her interest clearly heightened. "Private Martinez, do you understand the seriousness of what you're alleging? You're essentially accusing a general officer of systematic misconduct and suggesting that multiple other officers have been complicit in covering up his actions." "Yes, ma'am. I understand the implications, but I believe the evidence speaks for itself." One of Coleman's staff officers had been reviewing the contents of the storage device on a secure laptop. He looked up and whispered something to Coleman that Sarah couldn't hear, but she noticed that Coleman's expression became more serious and focused. "Private Martinez, I need you to walk me through the specific incidents that led to your decision to bring these allegations forward." For the next hour, Sarah detailed her experiences with General Hartwell, beginning with the public humiliation during the inspection and continuing through her investigation of his broader pattern of discrimination. She described the systematic harassment documented in Williams's recordings, the fabricated training failures that had forced out promising recruits, and the deliberate injuries that had been disguised as accidents. Coleman asked detailed questions about each incident, seeking clarification about dates, witnesses, and supporting documentation. Her interrogation was thorough and professional, but Sarah sensed that the Major General was taking her allegations seriously rather than dismissing them as the complaints of a disgruntled recruit. "Private Martinez, what outcome are you seeking from this complaint?" "Ma'am, I want the discrimination to stop. I want the female recruits who were wrongfully discharged to have their cases reviewed and their military careers restored if possible. And I want to ensure that future female soldiers don't face the same systematic harassment that has been occurring at Fort Braxton." Coleman nodded slowly. "Those are reasonable goals, but you must understand that investigating these allegations will require extensive resources and could take months to complete. Are you prepared for the scrutiny and potential retaliation that might result from your decision to come forward?" Sarah had thought carefully about this question during her weeks of preparation. "Ma'am, I joined the military to serve my country and uphold the values that make military service meaningful. If standing up to discrimination and harassment is part of that service, then I'm prepared to accept whatever consequences result from doing the right thing, even if those consequences include the end of your own military career." "Yes, ma'am. Some things are more important than individual advancement." Coleman studied Sarah for a long moment. And Sarah sensed that the Major General was evaluating not just her allegations, but her character and motivations. Finally, Coleman spoke again. "Private Martinez, there's something about your bearing and military knowledge that suggests you have more experience with military culture than most recruits. Is there anything about your background that I should know?" Sarah felt her stomach clench. This was the moment she had been dreading, when her carefully maintained anonymity would be challenged by a senior officer with the authority and resources to investigate her true identity. "Ma'am, my father is a career military officer. I grew up around military installations and learned military protocol from an early age." "What's your father's name and current assignment?" Sarah hesitated for a moment, knowing that her answer would fundamentally change how Major General Coleman viewed both her and her allegations. "General Robert Martinez, ma'am. He currently serves as Deputy Chief of Staff for Operations at the Pentagon." The silence that followed was profound. Sarah watched as Major General Coleman processed this information, clearly recognizing the name and understanding the implications of what she had just learned. "Private Martinez, does your father know about these allegations against General Hartwell?" "I spoke with him briefly about my concerns, ma'am, but I haven't provided him with the detailed evidence I've presented to you today." Coleman exchanged glances with her staff officers, and Sarah could see them having a silent conversation about how to handle this unexpected development. "Private Martinez, why didn't you use your father's influence to address these problems through unofficial channels?" "Because using family connections would have undermined my credibility and suggested that female soldiers need special protection to succeed in military service. I wanted to address these problems through proper channels and official procedures." Coleman leaned back in her chair, clearly impressed by Sarah's reasoning. "That's admirable, but it also means you've put yourself at considerable risk. General Hartwell's supporters will claim that your allegations are motivated by personal ambition or family politics rather than legitimate concerns about discrimination." "Ma'am, the evidence stands on its own regardless of my family background. The recordings, documentation, and witness statements speak to a pattern of discrimination that has affected dozens of female recruits." "You're right, but your family connection adds a political dimension to this situation that will need to be carefully managed. General Hartwell is being considered for promotion to Major General, and your father sits on the promotion board that will make that decision." Sarah felt a chill as she realized the full implications of what Coleman was saying. Her allegations against General Hartwell would inevitably be seen as an attempt by her father to influence the promotion process, regardless of the merit of the evidence she had presented. "Ma'am, does that mean my complaint won't be investigated because of potential conflicts of interest?" "On the contrary, it means that your complaint will receive the most thorough investigation possible. The Department of Defense cannot afford to have allegations of discrimination dismissed because of political considerations, especially when those allegations involve officers being considered for promotion." Coleman stood up, signaling that the interview was concluding. "Private Martinez, I'm going to have my team conduct a preliminary review of your evidence today. If it supports your allegations as strongly as you believe it does, we'll be launching a formal investigation that will involve interviews with dozens of personnel and a comprehensive review of training policies at Fort Braxton. What should I expect in terms of retaliation or consequences?" "You should expect that General Hartwell and his supporters will do everything possible to discredit you and your allegations. They'll question your motives, your credibility, and your fitness for military service. But you should also know that this investigation will have the full support of senior leadership at the Pentagon, including officers who outrank General Hartwell and have the authority to protect you from retaliation." As Sarah prepared to leave the conference room, Coleman offered one final piece of advice. "Private Martinez, what you've done today took tremendous courage, but the real test will be how you handle the pressure that's about to come your way. General Hartwell is a skilled political operator with powerful allies, and he's not going to give up his career without a fight. Sarah saluted Major General Coleman and left the conference room with a mixture of relief and apprehension. She had finally presented her evidence to someone with the authority to act on it, but she also knew that the most difficult part of her ordeal was just beginning. Within hours, word of her interview with the evaluation team would reach General Hartwell, and she would face the full force of his anger and political influence. But for the first time since arriving at Fort Braxton, Sarah felt confident that justice would ultimately prevail, regardless of the personal cost she might have to pay. The immediate aftermath of Sarah's interview with Major General Coleman was deceptively quiet. She returned to her regular training duties and evening routine as if nothing had changed, but she could sense the subtle shift in atmosphere around the base. Officers spoke in hushed tones during briefings. Administrative personnel seemed more nervous than usual, and there was an underlying tension that suggested something significant was happening behind the scenes. Major General Coleman's investigation team worked with remarkable efficiency and discretion. Within 24 hours of receiving Sarah's evidence, they had conducted preliminary interviews with Sergeant Rodriguez, reviewed Ashley Williams's recordings, and begun reaching out to former recruits who had been forced to leave Fort Braxton under questionable circumstances. The scope and speed of their investigation clearly indicated that Sarah's allegations were being taken seriously at the highest levels. General Hartwell's response was swift and predictably aggressive. On the morning of the third day after Sarah's interview, she was summoned to his office for what was officially described as a routine personnel discussion. Sarah knew that this meeting would be anything but routine, and she prepared herself for the confrontation she had been anticipating since the moment she decided to come forward with her evidence. The general's office was an imposing space designed to intimidate visitors and reinforce the power dynamics of military hierarchy. Awards, commendations, and photographs from Hartwell's 32-year career covered the walls, while his desk was positioned to force visitors to look up at him from uncomfortable chairs placed several feet away. Sarah entered the office at attention and remained standing until Hartwell gestured for her to sit. "Private Martinez," Hartwell began, his voice carefully controlled but carrying an undercurrent of barely contained rage. "I understand you've been having conversations with the evaluation team about your experiences at Fort Braxton." Sarah maintained her military bearing and chose her words carefully. "Yes, sir. Major General Coleman requested interviews with randomly selected personnel, and I was chosen to participate." "And during this interview, did you discuss any concerns or complaints about base operations or leadership?" The question was clearly designed to elicit information about what Sarah had told Coleman's team, but Sarah understood that anything she said could be used against her in disciplinary proceedings or character assassination attempts. "Sir, I answered Major General Coleman's questions honestly and completely, as required by military regulations." Hartwell leaned forward, his gray eyes cold and calculating. "Private Martinez, let me be very clear about something. False accusations against superior officers constitute serious violations of military law. Spreading rumors or making unfounded complaints can result in court-martial proceedings and dishonorable discharge." The threat was unmistakable, but Sarah had expected it. "Sir, I understand the serious nature of making false accusations, which is why I ensured that everything I discussed with Major General Coleman was supported by documented evidence." "Evidence?" Hartwell's voice rose slightly before he caught himself and resumed his controlled tone. "What kind of evidence could a recruit possibly have regarding complex military operations and personnel decisions that she couldn't possibly understand?" Sarah realized that Hartwell was fishing for information about what specific evidence she had presented to Coleman's team. His question suggested that he didn't yet know the full scope of what she had discovered, which meant that Williams's recordings and Rodriguez's documentation had remained secret despite the ongoing investigation. Sir, I simply answered Major General Coleman's questions based on my observations and experiences during my time at Fort Braxton. Hartwell stood up and walked to the window overlooking the main parade ground, his back to Sarah as he spoke. Private Martinez, you come from a military family. Your father is a distinguished officer who has served this country with honor for many years. I would hate to see his reputation tarnished by his daughter's poor judgment or misguided accusations. The mention of her father sent a chill down Sarah's spine. Hartwell had clearly discovered her family background and was now prepared to use it as leverage against her. The general's implicit threat to damage her father's career was both personally devastating and strategically brilliant, as it added a dimension of family loyalty to her already difficult situation. Sir, my father's career and reputation are based on his own actions and service record. My decisions and actions reflect only on myself. Hartwell turned back to face her, a slight smile playing at the corners of his mouth. That's a very naive view of how military politics actually work, Private Martinez. Your father sits on promotion boards, makes personnel decisions, and influences policy at the highest levels of the Pentagon. Any scandal involving his daughter inevitably reflects on his judgment and reliability. Sarah understood that Hartwell was trying to manipulate her into withdrawing her allegations by threatening consequences for her father's career. It was a sophisticated psychological attack that exploited her family loyalty, while also demonstrating the general's willingness to destroy innocent people to protect himself. Sir, I believe that my father's integrity and service record can withstand any scrutiny that might result from my actions. Perhaps, but why take that risk? Why put your family through unnecessary stress and uncertainty when there are other ways to address whatever concerns you might have? Hartwell returned to his desk and pulled out a manila folder that contained what appeared to be transfer orders. I've been reviewing your training record, Private Martinez, and I believe you might benefit from a change of environment. I can arrange for your immediate transfer to Fort Campbell, where you can complete your basic training under different leadership and with a fresh start. The offer was presented as an opportunity, but Sarah recognized it as another form of threat. Accepting the transfer would remove her from Fort Braxton before Coleman's investigation could be completed, effectively silencing her testimony and allowing Hartwell to claim that her allegations had been resolved through appropriate administrative action. Sir, I prefer to complete my training here at Fort Braxton with my current company. Hartwell's expression hardened. Private Martinez, let me explain something about military leadership that you might not fully understand. Effective commanders sometimes have to make difficult decisions that appear harsh but serve the greater good. The integration of women into combat roles requires careful management and realistic assessment of capabilities. Sarah realized that Hartwell was about to reveal his true beliefs about women in military service, possibly providing her with additional evidence of discriminatory intent. Some female recruits simply aren't suited for the demands of military life, Hartwell continued. It's not a reflection on their worth as people, but rather an acknowledgement of biological and psychological realities that political correctness often prevents us from discussing openly. Sir, are you suggesting that women are inherently less capable of military service than men? I'm suggesting that pretending there are no differences between men and women doesn't serve anyone's interests, including the women who might be better suited for different types of service roles. Sarah felt her anger building at Hartwell's condescending explanation, but she also recognized that he was providing her with exactly the kind of discriminatory statements that would support Coleman's investigation. Sir, with respect, my training performance and that of many other female recruits suggests that women are fully capable of meeting military standards when given fair and equal opportunity. Hartwell's mask of professional courtesy finally slipped. revealing the contempt that had been driving his discriminatory policies. Fair and equal opportunity doesn't mean ignoring reality, Private Martinez. It means recognizing that some positions require capabilities that not everyone possesses, regardless of their determination or political support. The conversation was interrupted by a knock on the office door, followed by the entrance of Lieutenant Colonel Harrison carrying what appeared to be urgent communications. Harrison whispered something to Hartwell that caused the general's expression to become even more serious and focused. "Private Martinez," Hartwell said after Harrison left, "it appears that our conversation will need to continue at another time. You're dismissed." Sarah saluted and left the office, but not before noticing that Harrison had delivered what looked like official correspondence from the Pentagon. She suspected that Coleman's investigation had already reached senior leadership in Washington, and that Hartwell was beginning to understand the full scope of the scrutiny he was facing. Over the following days, the pace of Coleman's investigation accelerated dramatically. Sarah observed teams of investigators interviewing personnel throughout the base, reviewing training records, and examining documentation that had previously been restricted or classified. The atmosphere at Fort Braxton became increasingly tense as rumors spread about the nature and scope of the investigation. Sarah's role in triggering the investigation was still not widely known, but she noticed that some officers and non-commissioned officers were treating her differently. Some seemed more respectful and cautious around her, suggesting that word had spread about her family connections. Others appeared hostile or suspicious, indicating that Hartwell's supporters were identifying her as a threat to their careers and interests. The most significant development came when Sarah learned that Major General Coleman had requested direct communication with her father at the Pentagon. The conversation between Coleman and General Robert Martinez lasted over an hour and covered not only Sarah's allegations, but also broader concerns about discrimination and equal opportunity throughout the military. Sarah's father called her that evening using secure base communications, his voice carrying a mixture of pride and concern that she had never heard before. "Sarah, Major General Coleman briefed me on your allegations against General Hartwell and the evidence you've provided to support them. I want you to know that I'm proud of your courage and integrity, but I'm also concerned about the challenges you're going to face as this investigation proceeds. Dad, are you going to face any consequences because of my decision to come forward?" "Sweetheart, my career can take care of itself. What matters is that you've exposed serious problems that needed to be addressed. The evidence you've collected suggests systematic discrimination that goes far beyond what anyone previously suspected." Sarah felt relief at her father's support, but she also sensed that he was holding back information about the political implications of her allegations. "Dad, what happens next?" "The investigation is going to expand beyond Fort Braxton to examine Hartwell's entire career and look for similar patterns at his previous assignments. The Pentagon is taking this very seriously, especially given the implications for his pending promotion. What about retaliation against me or the other people who provided evidence?" "You'll have protection from the highest levels. Sarah, Major General Coleman has assured me that anyone who attempts to retaliate against witnesses in this investigation will face immediate consequences." Despite her father's reassurances, Sarah knew that the most difficult part of her ordeal was still ahead. Hartwell and his supporters would not give up without a fight, and they would use every resource at their disposal to discredit her allegations and protect their careers. That night, as Sarah prepared for sleep in the barracks, she reflected on how much had changed since her first confrontation with General Hartwell. What had begun as a single incident of public humiliation had evolved into a comprehensive investigation of systematic discrimination that could reshape military culture and policy. She thought about Ashley Williams and the other women who had been forced out of military service, about Sergeant Rodriguez and the current female recruits who were still enduring harassment, and about the future generations of women who would benefit from the changes that might result from this investigation. Sarah Martinez had enlisted in the military to serve her country, but she had discovered that sometimes the most important service involved fighting battles against corruption and injustice within the very institution she had sworn to defend. The outcome of those battles would determine not only her own future, but the future of every woman who chose to wear the uniform in service to their nation. The investigation that Sarah had triggered was now beyond her control, but she had provided the evidence and testimony that made it possible. Whatever happened next would depend on whether the military justice system had the integrity and courage to hold its senior leaders accountable for their actions, regardless of their rank or political connections. The confrontation that would determine the fate of General Hartwell's career and Sarah's allegations arrived with the precision of a military operation. Major General Coleman had spent 5 days conducting what she privately described as the most comprehensive investigation of discriminatory practices she had ever overseen. The evidence collected during that period painted a damning picture of systematic harassment that extended far beyond Fort Braxton and reached back through multiple assignments spanning Hartwell's career. On Monday morning, Coleman assembled every officer and senior non-commissioned officer at Fort Braxton for what was announced as a command climate assessment briefing. The base theater was packed with personnel who understood that something significant was about to happen, though most had no idea of the specific charges that were about to be leveled against their commanding general. Sarah sat in the back row with other junior enlisted personnel, her stomach churning with anticipation and dread. She had been informed the previous evening that she would be called to testify publicly about her experiences, making her role in the investigation impossible to hide any longer. The prospect of confronting General Hartwell in front of the entire base leadership was both terrifying and exhilarating. Major General Coleman took the stage with the bearing of an officer who had made career-defining decisions and was prepared to defend them against any challenge. Her presentation began with a review of military equal opportunity policies and the legal obligations that all officers swore to uphold when accepting their commissions. The audience listened with the respectful attention required by military protocol, but Sarah could sense the growing tension as Coleman's remarks became more specific and pointed. Over the past week, Coleman announced, my investigation team has uncovered evidence of systematic discrimination against female personnel at this installation. This discrimination has taken multiple forms, including harassment, manipulation of training standards, deliberate assignment of dangerous duties, and orchestrated efforts to force qualified women out of military service. The silence in the theater was profound. Sarah watched as officers throughout the audience shifted uncomfortably in their seats, some clearly surprised by the allegations, while others appeared to be calculating the potential impact on their own careers. Coleman activated a large display screen that showed statistical data documenting the dramatic increase in female recruit failures and departures since General Hartwell's assignment to Fort Braxton. The numbers were stark and undeniable, showing patterns that could not be explained by coincidence or legitimate training standards. These statistics represent more than administrative data, Coleman continued. They represent the destruction of military careers, the waste of training resources, and the violation of fundamental principles that define our military service. Sarah felt her heart racing as Coleman began presenting specific evidence, including excerpts from Ashley Williams's recordings that captured General Hartwell discussing his strategy for reducing female enrollment. The general's own words filled the theater, his voice clear and unmistakable as he outlined his discriminatory policies to Lieutenant Colonel Harrison. The reaction was immediate and visceral. Gasps and murmurs swept through the audience as officers heard their commanding general openly discussing illegal discrimination. Sarah watched General Hartwell's face as his own recorded words condemned him before his entire command. His expression shifted from confident authority to desperate calculation as he realized the scope of the evidence arrayed against him. Coleman allowed the recording to play for several minutes, ensuring that everyone present understood the deliberate and systematic nature of the discrimination that had been occurring under their command. When the audio finally stopped, the theater remained silent except for the sound of ventilation systems and the distant noise of training activities continuing elsewhere on the base. The investigation has also uncovered evidence of deliberate training accidents designed to injure female recruits and provide grounds for their medical discharge, Coleman announced, displaying photographs and documentation from Ashley Williams's case. Equipment sabotage, modified safety protocols, and falsified incident reports were used to create the appearance of training failures while actually endangering the lives of military personnel. Sarah watched Lieutenant Colonel Harrison sink lower in his seat as additional evidence implicated him in the conspiracy. Several other officers named in the investigation appeared equally uncomfortable, their careers hanging in the balance as Coleman methodically destroyed their defenses. Private Sarah Martinez, Coleman called, gesturing toward the back of the theater. Please come forward to provide your testimony. Sarah stood on unsteady legs and walked down the center aisle toward the stage, feeling hundreds of eyes tracking her movement. The walk seemed to take forever, but finally she reached the front of the theater and took her position at the witness microphone that had been set up for testimony. Private Martinez, Coleman began, please tell this assembly what happened during your inspection by General Hartwell on September 15th. Sarah took a deep breath and began recounting the incident that had started her investigation. Her voice was steady despite her nervousness, and she provided detailed testimony about General Hartwell's public humiliation of her perfectly executed military salute. She described his verbal assault, the intimidation tactics he used, and the atmosphere of fear and discrimination that his behavior created. As Sarah spoke, she noticed General Hartwell leaning forward in his seat, his face flushed with anger, and his hands clenched into fists. She could see him preparing to interrupt her testimony, but Major General Coleman's presence and authority kept him silent. Private Martinez, what motivated you to investigate General Hartwell's treatment of other female recruits? Coleman asked. Ma'am, I realized that my experience wasn't isolated. I discovered that General Hartwell had been systematically targeting female soldiers for harassment and discrimination, using his position and authority to drive qualified women out of military service. How did you gather evidence to support these allegations? Sarah described her investigation methodology, her cooperation with Sergeant Rodriguez, and her contact with former recruits who had been forced out under fraudulent circumstances. She explained how the evidence had revealed a deliberate conspiracy to manipulate training results and fabricate grounds for discharge. General Hartwell finally could no longer contain himself. He stood abruptly and addressed Major General Coleman directly, his voice carrying across the theater. Ma'am, I object to this character assassination disguised as official testimony. Private Martinez is the daughter of General Robert Martinez, who sits on the promotion board reviewing my advancement to Major General. This entire investigation is a politically motivated attack designed to influence the promotion process. The revelation of Sarah's family connection sent shockwaves through the audience. Officers who had been listening carefully to her testimony now viewed her allegations through the lens of potential political manipulation. Sarah felt her credibility evaporating as murmurs and whispers spread throughout the theater. Coleman's response was swift and decisive. General Hartwell, the political connections of witnesses do not invalidate evidence. Private Martinez's family background has been fully disclosed and considered throughout this investigation. The recordings, documentation, and testimony from multiple independent sources speak to systematic discrimination, regardless of who presented them initially. This is a coordinated attack on my career and reputation, Hartwell insisted, his voice rising with desperation. Private Martinez and her supporters have fabricated evidence and manipulated testimony to serve political purposes. Sarah felt compelled to respond to Hartwell's accusations. Sir, the evidence speaks for itself. Your own recorded words demonstrate your discriminatory policies. The pattern of harassment and manipulation is documented through multiple independent sources. My family background doesn't change the fact that you have violated military law and destroyed the careers of qualified female soldiers. The exchange between Sarah and General Hartwell created an electric tension in the theater. This was no longer just an administrative hearing. It had become a direct confrontation between a general officer and the private who had exposed his corruption. Private Martinez, Hartwell said, his voice dripping with condescension. You have no understanding of the complexities of military leadership or the difficult decisions that commanders must make to maintain unit effectiveness and readiness. Sarah's military bearing and months of frustration crystallized into a moment of absolute clarity. Sir, I understand that military leadership requires difficult decisions, but those decisions must be based on legitimate military criteria rather than gender discrimination. I understand that maintaining unit effectiveness requires evaluating personnel fairly rather than manipulating training results to achieve predetermined outcomes. She paused, looking directly at General Hartwell. The confidence that came from knowing she was absolutely right. And I understand that my father didn't raise me to use family connections to advance my career, but he did raise me to stand up for what's right, regardless of the personal cost. What you've done at Fort Braxton isn't military leadership, sir. It's abuse of power disguised as command authority. The theater erupted in applause from junior personnel who had witnessed months of discriminatory treatment but had been powerless to challenge it. The sound was immediately suppressed by senior officers, but the moment of solidarity was unmistakable and powerful. Major General Coleman restored order and continued her presentation, calling additional witnesses and presenting documentation that corroborated every aspect of Sarah's allegations. Sergeant Rodriguez testified about her documentation efforts. Former recruits provided testimony via secure video link, and even some male officers came forward to confirm what they had witnessed, but had been too intimidated to report. The cumulative weight of evidence was overwhelming. By the time Coleman finished her presentation, General Hartwell's career was effectively over, and several of his supporters faced their own disciplinary proceedings. General Hartwell, Coleman announced, based on the evidence presented during this investigation, you are hereby relieved of command pending formal court-martial proceedings on charges of discrimination, harassment, conspiracy, and conduct unbecoming an officer. Security personnel immediately moved to escort Hartwell from the theater, but he turned to address the audience one final time. This investigation represents everything that's wrong with political correctness and social engineering in our military, he declared. You're destroying unit cohesion and combat effectiveness to satisfy political agendas that have nothing to do with military readiness. Sarah watched as General Hartwell was escorted from the theater, his 32-year career ending in disgrace and dishonor. She felt no satisfaction in his downfall, only relief that his systematic discrimination would finally end, and that future female soldiers would be protected from similar abuse. Major General Coleman concluded the briefing by announcing immediate policy changes at Fort Braxton, including new oversight procedures, enhanced equal opportunity training, and independent review processes for personnel decisions involving female recruits. She also announced that all female soldiers who had been wrongfully discharged would have their cases reviewed and their military careers restored if appropriate. As the assembly dispersed, Sarah found herself surrounded by fellow recruits who wanted to congratulate her on her courage and thank her for standing up to systematic discrimination. The support was gratifying, but Sarah also noticed the hostile glances from some officers whose careers had been damaged by association with General Hartwell's policies. The immediate battle was over, but Sarah understood that the broader war for equality and fair treatment in military service would continue long after General Hartwell's court-martial was completed. She had proven that individual courage could challenge systematic corruption, but sustaining that progress would require ongoing vigilance and commitment from military leaders at every level. That evening, Sarah received a phone call from her father congratulating her on her testimony and expressing his pride in her integrity and courage. He also informed her that General Hartwell's pending promotion had been immediately canceled, and that a comprehensive review of discrimination policies would be conducted throughout the military. Sarah Martinez had enlisted to serve her country, but she had discovered that sometimes the most important service involved fighting battles against injustice within the very institution she had sworn to defend. The victory at Fort Braxton would serve as a precedent for future cases and a reminder that military honor required protecting all soldiers regardless of their gender, background, or political connections. 3 years had passed since the Fort Braxton investigation, and the military justice system had delivered comprehensive consequences for General Hartwell's systematic discrimination. The court-martial proceedings had resulted in his dismissal from service, forfeiture of all pay and allowances, and a federal conviction that would follow him for the rest of his civilian life. Lieutenant Colonel Harrison and 4 other officers had received lesser but still career-ending punishments, sending a clear message throughout the military that discrimination would not be tolerated at any level. Sarah had completed her basic training at Fort Braxton under new leadership that emphasized equal opportunity and fair treatment for all personnel. Her performance had been exemplary, earning her selection for officer candidate school and eventually a commission as a second lieutenant in the military police corps. She had chosen that specialty specifically because it would allow her to investigate and prevent the kind of systematic abuse she had experienced firsthand. The changes at Fort Braxton had been dramatic and lasting. Under the leadership of Colonel Patricia Wells, the base had become a model for gender integration and equal opportunity. Training. Female recruit retention rates had returned to national averages, and the installation had received multiple commendations for its innovative approaches to creating inclusive military culture. Ashley Williams had been reinstated as an active duty soldier with full back pay and benefits, her wrongful discharge officially reversed by a military review board. She had completed her training and earned promotion to sergeant, becoming a vocal advocate for military justice reform and a mentor for other female soldiers facing discrimination. Sergeant Rodriguez had been promoted to staff sergeant and assigned as the equal opportunity advisor for the entire installation, using her documentation and investigation skills to prevent future cases of systematic harassment. Her work had been recognized throughout the Army as a model for proactive discrimination prevention. Sarah's own military career had flourished despite initial concerns that her role in exposing General Hartwell's corruption might mark her as a troublemaker. Instead, senior leaders had recognized her integrity and investigative capabilities, assigning her to positions where those skills could be used to strengthen military culture and protect vulnerable personnel. Her current assignment was at the Pentagon, working in the Inspector General's office under the direct supervision of her father, who had been promoted to full general and appointed as the Army's Inspector General. The appointment had been controversial given Sarah's role in the Fort Braxton investigation, but General Robert Martinez's reputation for integrity and his commitment to military justice had overcome political objections. Sarah's office was located in the same corridor where decisions about military careers and policies were made at the highest levels. Her daily responsibilities included reviewing discrimination complaints, conducting investigations of senior officers, and developing policies to prevent the kind of systematic abuse that had occurred at Fort Braxton. The work was challenging and often frustrating, as entrenched attitudes and institutional resistance made change slow and difficult. But Sarah had learned that lasting reform required patience, persistence, and the willingness to fight the same battles repeatedly until justice finally prevailed. On a crisp October morning, Sarah was reviewing a particularly complex case involving allegations of sexual harassment at a training facility in Georgia when her father knocked on her office door. General Martinez had aged visibly during his tenure as Inspector General, the weight of investigating misconduct within his own institution taking a toll that was evident in his gray hair and lined face. "Sarah, I have something I want to show you," he said, settling into the chair across from her desk with a thick folder in his hands. "Another case?" Sarah asked, setting aside her current work to focus on her father's unexpected visit. "This is a report on military culture and equal opportunity that's being prepared for the Secretary of Defense," he replied, opening the folder to reveal charts, statistics, and policy recommendations. "I thought you'd be interested in the section that discusses the Fort Braxton investigation and its impact on military-wide reforms." Sarah accepted the document and began reading the executive summary, which detailed how her confrontation with General Hartwell had triggered comprehensive changes in military policy and culture. The report documented improvements in female retention rates, enhanced equal opportunity training programs, and new oversight mechanisms designed to prevent future cases of systematic discrimination. "This is remarkable," Sarah said as she reviewed the statistical data. "Female officer retention has improved by 37% across all service branches since the Fort Braxton reforms were implemented. The changes go beyond just numbers." Her father replied, "The investigation created a precedent that has made it much easier for victims of discrimination to come forward and seek justice. Your courage in confronting General Hartwell gave other soldiers the confidence to report misconduct that might otherwise have been ignored or suppressed." Sarah felt a deep sense of satisfaction as she read about specific cases where the Fort Braxton precedent had been used to protect soldiers and hold commanders accountable. Her individual act of defiance had created ripple effects that were still generating positive changes throughout the military justice system. "There's something else," General Martinez continued, pulling out an official-looking document with military seals and ribbons. "The Secretary of Defense has approved a special commendation recognizing your contribution to military justice reform. You'll be receiving the Secretary of Defense Medal for Exceptional Public Service at a ceremony next month." Sarah stared at the citation, reading the formal language that described her actions at Fort Braxton and their impact on military culture. The honor was significant and unprecedented for someone of her rank and experience, representing recognition that her courage had served broader purposes beyond her individual situation. "Dad, this feels surreal. 3 years ago, I was just a recruit trying to complete basic training without drawing attention to myself. 3 years ago, you were already the person who would risk everything to stand up for what's right," he corrected. "The circumstances at Fort Braxton just gave you the opportunity to demonstrate that character." The conversation was interrupted by Sarah's desk phone, which displayed a call from Major General Coleman's office. Sarah had maintained regular contact with Coleman since the Fort Braxton investigation, and the senior officer had become both a mentor and a powerful advocate for military justice reform. "Lieutenant Martinez, I hope you have time to talk," Coleman said when Sarah answered the call. "I'm calling with news that I think you'll find very encouraging." "Yes, ma'am." "What's the news?" "The President has nominated me for promotion to Lieutenant General and assignment as the military's first Director of Equal Opportunity and Inclusion. The position is being created specifically to coordinate discrimination prevention efforts across all service branches." Sarah felt a surge of excitement at the news. Coleman's promotion represented recognition that equal opportunity was a critical military priority requiring senior leadership attention and resources. "Ma'am, that's outstanding news. Congratulations on the nomination." "Thank you, but I'm calling Because I want you to consider joining my staff when the appointment is confirmed. I need officers with your investigative skills and commitment to justice to help build this new organization. The offer represented exactly the kind of career opportunity that Sarah had hoped for when she decided to pursue military service. Working with Coleman would allow her to have a direct impact on military culture and policy, while continuing to develop her skills as an investigator and reformer. Ma'am, I'm definitely interested. What would the position involve? You'd be responsible for developing investigation protocols, training programs, and oversight mechanisms to prevent systematic discrimination. You'd also serve as a liaison with congressional committees and civilian oversight organizations that monitor military equal opportunity efforts. Sarah realized that accepting Coleman's offer would represent the culmination of everything she had worked toward since her confrontation with General Hartwell. Instead of being a victim of systematic discrimination, she would become one of the primary architects of the systems designed to prevent it. Ma'am, I accept the position. When would you need me to start? If my nomination is confirmed, I'd want you on my staff immediately. We have a lot of work ahead of us, and I need people I can trust to help build something that will protect future generations of military personnel. After ending the call with Coleman, Sarah sat in her Pentagon office contemplating how dramatically her life had changed since that morning at Fort Braxton when General Hartwell had humiliated her in front of 300 recruits. The naive young woman who had wanted to complete basic training anonymously had evolved into a senior officer whose career was built around fighting the very kind of abuse she had experienced. Her father had remained in her office during the phone call, and she could see the pride in his expression as he understood the significance of Coleman's offer. You realize what this means, he said quietly. You'll be in a position to influence military culture and policy at the highest levels. The changes you help implement will affect every soldier who serves after you. Sarah nodded, feeling the weight of responsibility that came with such opportunities. It's exactly what I hoped for when I decided to fight back against General Hartwell. The chance to make sure that other soldiers don't have to endure what I experienced. There will be challenges, her father warned. Not everyone in the military supports the changes that have been implemented since Fort Braxton. You'll face resistance from officers who believe that equal opportunity efforts undermine military effectiveness and readiness. I've been facing that resistance for 3 years, Sarah replied. But I've also seen the positive changes that result when discrimination is eliminated, and all soldiers are given fair opportunities to succeed. That evening, Sarah drove to Arlington National Cemetery to visit the graves of soldiers who had died serving their country. She often came here when she needed perspective on her military service and the responsibilities that came with wearing the uniform. The rows of white headstones represented the ultimate sacrifice that military personnel were prepared to make, and they reminded her that her own struggles with discrimination were part of a larger commitment to protecting the values that made such sacrifice meaningful. As she walked among the graves, Sarah thought about Ashley Williams, Sergeant Rodriguez, and the dozens of other women whose careers had been damaged by General Hartwell's systematic discrimination. Their courage in coming forward and providing testimony had made the Fort Braxton investigation possible, and their continued service demonstrated that military women could overcome even the most determined efforts to exclude them. She also thought about the future female soldiers who would benefit from the reforms that had been implemented since the investigation. They would face challenges and obstacles, but they would serve in an environment where systematic discrimination was less likely to be tolerated or ignored. Sarah's phone buzzed with a text message from Ashley Williams, who had seen news reports about Coleman's nomination and Sarah's expected role in the new Equal Opportunity Organization. Congratulations on the new assignment. You've earned the chance to make lasting changes. Thank you for never giving up on justice. The message was followed by similar congratulations from Sergeant Rodriguez, several other Fort Braxton veterans, and even some male officers who had supported the investigation. Despite personal and professional risks. As Sarah prepared to leave the cemetery, she paused at the grave of a female soldier who had died in Afghanistan, a young woman whose sacrifice reminded her that military service required many different types of courage. Some soldiers faced enemy fire in foreign countries, while others fought battles against injustice within their own institutions. Both forms of service were essential to protecting the freedoms and values that defined American democracy. Sarah Martinez had discovered her calling in fighting those internal battles, ensuring that the military remained worthy of the sacrifices made by those who served in its ranks. The next morning, she would return to her Pentagon office and continue the work of building a more just and equitable military culture. It was work that would never be completed, as each generation of leaders would face new challenges and obstacles. But the precedent established at Fort Braxton had proven that individual courage could create lasting institutional change. Sarah's confrontation with General Hartwell had demonstrated that even the most junior personnel could hold senior leaders accountable when they possessed the evidence, the integrity, and the determination to fight for what was right. The young woman who had been humiliated during a military inspection had become a senior officer, whose career was dedicated to ensuring that such humiliation would never again be tolerated in the United States military. It was a transformation that represented both personal growth and institutional progress, proof that justice and equality could prevail when good people refused to accept the status quo. 5 years later, Lieutenant Colonel Sarah Martinez stood before a packed auditorium at West Point, addressing the newest class of military academy cadets. Behind her, a large screen displayed the official portrait of General Patricia Coleman, now the military's most senior female officer and architect of comprehensive equal opportunity reforms. The general you see behind me started her career when women weren't allowed in combat roles, Sarah told the diverse group of young faces before her. Today, 37% of you are women, and you'll graduate into a military where your gender won't determine your opportunities or limit your potential. A young female cadet raised her hand. Ma'am, how do we maintain these changes when we face officers who still hold outdated views? Sarah smiled, remembering her own naive questions as a recruit. You document everything, you support each other, and you never forget that courage isn't about being fearless, it's about doing what's right despite your fears. After the presentation, Sarah walked across the academy grounds where her father had graduated 35 years earlier. Her phone displayed a news alert. Former General Hartwell's civilian discrimination case dismissed. Continues pattern of legal failures. Even in civilian life, he remained unchanged. But the cadets she'd just addressed would graduate into a military transformed by the precedent she'd helped establish. They would serve in an institution where systematic discrimination faced immediate consequences, where victims had protection and recourse, and where integrity was valued over political convenience. As Sarah looked out at the Hudson River, she realized her story wasn't really about one woman confronting one corrupt general. It was about how ordinary people could create extraordinary change when they refused to accept injustice. If this story of courage and transformation inspired you, please subscribe to our channel for more real-life stories of people who chose to fight for what's right. Share this video with someone who needs to hear that one person really can make a difference. What would you have done in Sarah's situation? Let us know in the comments below, and don't forget to hit that notification bell for our latest content.